Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the sweltering, salt-scented air of a medieval port, where the sound of gulls overhead is almost drowned out by the clatter of wooden crates and the shouts of merchants bargaining over goods they'll never taste themselves. And you, lucky or unlucky, depending on your perspective, are about to get your first whiff of something that could make you rich beyond imagining, or bankrupt you before the week is out. Spoiler: in this business, you might not survive your first day without losing your shirt. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I always love knowing who's drifting off in the same midnight haze as me. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on a creaking dock, boots dusted with salt from the spray, watching a battered cog ship rolling on the tide. The hull is painted with faded patterns from somewhere far warmer than this place. Dock hands rush forward, ropes in hand, as the captain shouts orders in a language you almost did not quite understand. And then it hits you, a smell so sharp, so alive, it cuts through the fishy stink of the harbor like sunlight through a shutter. Pepper, not the ground, dusty kind you've sprinkled on your breakfast. XO. This is fresh from the sacks, pungent, spicy, and rich. You've never smelled money before, but you're pretty sure this is what it would be like. A local merchant sidles up, eyes on the ship's cargo, murmuring that a single sack of pepper is worth more than a year's wages for a skilled craftsman. You glance down the dock, and there's a man counting the peppercorns, one by one, as though each were a coin, and in a way, they are. Pepper here isn't just seasoning, it's currency, power, and prestige all in one. Some kings hoard it like gold, some cities store it under lock and key, guarded like royal treasure. You watch as port inspectors move in, dipping scoops into the sacks to check for adulteration, tiny stones, bits of husk, anything that might cheat the buyer. Rumor has it that in Venice, merchants can be fined the equivalent of a house for selling bad pepper. Of course, historians still debate whether those punishments were ever enforced, or if they were more of a warning to keep the trade respectable. Around you, the port buzzes with a subtle choreography of spice commerce, scribes taking notes, runners dashing off with news, dockside taverns already preparing to host heated price negotiations deep into the night. The air is thick with possibility, and the pepper scent follows you like a promise you're not sure you should trust. You wake the next morning to the rhythmic creak of ropes and the slow groan of wooden beams adjusting to the tide. The port hasn't slept. It never does. Out in the mist, you spot the pepper ship's crew unloading more sacks, each one looking like it could be the difference between comfort and ruin. And today, you're here to learn why pepper isn't just valuable, it's black gold. The marketplace is already in full swing. Even though the sun is still dragging itself over the horizon, merchants crouch over wooden chests, weighing out peppercorns with brass scales so delicate they could tip from the weight of a single coin. You watch one man, obviously a veteran of this trade, bite into a peppercorn, chew thoughtfully, and nod, as though approving a fine wine. That's when it hits you. Pepper here is less about taste and more about status. If you can afford to serve it, you can afford just about anything. At the far end of the square, you find a wealthy cloth dealer negotiating for a jar of pepper, not a sack, not a chesta jar. The dealer's face twists when the price is whispered in his ear, and you almost laugh. You've read that in some cities, a pound of pepper could buy a servant for an entire year. And in certain treaties, pepper is literally listed alongside gold coins, livestock, and jewels as acceptable payment, treated like currency. A spice broker tells you as he leans against a column. It doesn't spoil quickly, it's easy to store, and everyone wants it. He rolls a peppercorn between his fingers like a gambler considering a lucky die. And remember, if you have it, you can open doors in places you didn't even know existed. Of course, you also hear whispers about the dangers, Pirates targeting spice ships, thieves breaking into warehouses, corrupt officials skimming a handful from every sack. Historians still debate whether the pepper trade's risk was worth the reward for most merchants, especially those who never lived long enough to enjoy their fortune. By midday, the air is thick with a spice scent, mingling with the tang of sea salt and the yeasty smell of baking bread from nearby stalls. You watch as a group of dockworkers carry a fresh delivery into a heavily guarded storeroom. The iron lock glinting in the sunlight. The broker catches your eye again, smirks, and says, "The trick isn't getting pepper. The trick is keeping it somewhere in that scent." In the clink of scales and the shuffle of coins, you understand why kingdoms have fought wars over this tiny, wrinkled berry. And as the broker disappears into the crowd, you can't shake the feeling that this smell, warm, biting, and full of promise, might follow you for the rest of your life. The trail to cinnamon begins not at the docks, but in the cramped back rooms of merchant houses, where maps are spread across scarred tables and fingers trace lines across oceans and deserts. You've been invited. Well, drag it into one of these strategy meetings. The men around you speak in low, conspiratorial tones about a source so secret that even the sailors who deliver the goods might not know where they truly came from. Cinnamon, they say, is rarer than an honest tax collector. Officially, it comes from a distant land guarded by fierce tribes, or perhaps from nests built by giant birds who must be tricked into abandoning their fragrant twigs. At least, that's what the traders claim. You quickly realize these stories are as much a part of the business as the spice itself, designed to keep competitors from finding the real trees. Historians still debate how many of these origin tales were deliberate fabrications, and how many were just old myths carried along the trade routes like dust on the wind. Your first encounter with cinnamon in the flesh, well, Barkis in the dim light of a merchant's storeroom. The sticks are curled tightly, each one smelling faintly of warmth and sweetness, as if they were holding on to a memory of summer. A single bundle is worth more than some families are named months. You run your fingers along the surface, feeling the delicate flecking texture, and the merchant warns you to be careful, break one, and you pay for it. Later that afternoon, you wander the market stalls, where cinnamon is on display beside bowls of silk and jars of saffron. A spice dealer unrolls a scrap of parchment covered in cramped writing letters from a noble household, demanding precise quantities for their kitchen, their perfumer, and their physician. In this world, cinnamon is as likely to be boiled in wine for a feast as it is to be ground into a powder for some questionable restorative tonic. At one stall, a grizzled trader laughs when you ask where his cinnamon comes from. "If I told you," he says, "you'd be dead before you reach the docks." You're not sure if he's joking, but given the tight grip on the pouch at his belt, you decide not to press the matter. He does, however, let slip one truth. No matter how secretive the trade, the cinnamon eventually passes through the hands of only a few key middlemen who could collapse an entire market with a single decision. As the sun sets, the scent of cinnamon lingers in the air, wrapping itself around the salty breeze. Somewhere out there, the real groves are growing in guarded silence, and you know you'll probably never see them. Still, the mystery is part of the pull. The less you know, the more you want it, and that, perhaps, is the most valuable commodity of all. The market squares louder today, and you can smell why before you see it. A sharp, almost floral note slices through the heavier scents of bread, fish, and bodies in close quarters. You follow it to a crowd gathered around a long table draped in bright cloth, where small wooden boxes sit in a neat row. Each box holds a treasure, cloves. They're small, dark brown, but sinister looking, until you hear the price. The auctioneer's voice booms over the crowd, rattling off numbers that make you involuntarily glance at your own coin pouch. Around you, people murmur in disbelief, or nod sagely if they've been here before. Someone elbows you and whispers that cloves can fetch more than their weight in silver in certain cities. You pick one up, roll it between your fingers, and sniff. It's intense, sweet, and spicy all at once. The kind of scent that stays in your nose long after you put it down. A spice broker explains that cloves aren't just for cooking. They're medicine, perfume, and even breath freshener for the nobility. One clove chewed discreetly at a banquet can tell your host you're a person of means. Historians still argue whether these tiny buds actually did have the things people claimed, or if most of it was just clever marketing from traders with good stories. The auction begins. A merchant from Venice raises his hand. Then a trader from Cairo counters without hesitation. The numbers climb. You feel the same tension, as if you were watching gamblers throw fortunes into the air. And in a way, you Arethes buyers might not see a profit for months, maybe years, depending on the route and the wines. At the edge of the square, a boy in a patched tunic offers to sell you a handful from his own pouch. It looks tempting, but the warning from yesterday's pepper merchant echoes in your mind. The trick isn't buying spices, it's knowing what you're buying. You pass, and the boy shrugs, already scanning the crowd for someone more gullible. Back near the auction table, the winning bidder cradles his purchase like a newborn. The cloves are weighed, sealed in wax cloth, and handed over with a nod of respect. You catch the faintest whiff as it passes, and for a moment, you understand why wars have been fought over less. As the crowd disperses, you realize that the scent of cloves lingers longer than the noise of the market. You walk away thinking about how something so small could command such fierce attention, and how, in the spice trade, size means nothing compared to allure. The sea is calmer than usual this morning, a sheet of gray-blue stretching toward a horizon, broken only by the faint smudge of land. That smudge, your captain tells you, is worth more than the rest of the voyage combined. You're headed for the Banda Island's so-called Spice Island shome of nutmeg. The closer you get, the more the air changes. There's a warmth to it now, carrying a faintly sweet, woody scent that's almost intoxicating. It clings to the sails, ropes, your clothes. By the time you step onto the creaking dock, you feel as though you've been marinating in it. On shore, warehouses loom like quiet fortresses. Guards stand at the gates with spears in hand, and their eyes track every movement. Nutmeg is no ordinary commodity here. It's a guarded secret, a prize so valuable that foreign powers have sent fleets halfway across the world just to claim it. You've heard the rumors. In Europe, a small pouch of nutmeg can sell for enough to buy a townhouse, and in some plague-stricken cities, people believe it can ward off death itself. Historians still debate whether anyone actually believed in its medicinal powers, or if it was just another brilliant sales pitch by desperate merchants. You follow a local guide into a drying shed, where rows of wooden racks are covered with the fruit's inner treasures. Each nutmeg seed is wrapped in a lacy red covering called mace, which itself is a spice worth a small fortune. The guide lifts one up for you to smell, and you nearly cough at the sharp, heady aroma. Careful, he says with a grin. This smell changes lives. Sometimes it ruins them. Outside, the harbor is busier, no boats being loaded with crates stamped with the mark of the Dutch East India Company. Men shout in a mix of languages as they haul the cargo toward the ships. You spot a smaller vessel being quietly filled with unmarked sacks, and your guide subtly turns you away. Smuggling, you realize, is as much a part of this trade as official contracts. By evening, you're sitting on a bamboo porch overlooking the water, watching the sun melt into the horizon. The scent of nutmeg is still in the air, mingling with the tang of the sea. You take a slow breath, and for a moment, it's easy to forget that people have bled, schemed, and sailed into storms for the sake of this little brown seed. Somewhere in the fading light, you understand the unspoken truth. In the medieval spice trade, beauty and danger often come wrapped in the same package. The first thing you notice is the color, an almost unnatural shade of red-orange that catches the light like embers. Saffron, you've seen gold coins before, but even they don't glow with this kind of quiet intensity. The merchant lays a bundle in front of you, the delicate threads coiled like a pile of spent sunlight. and you suddenly understand why this spice is sold in pinches, not handfuls. You lean closer, inhaling that faint, honey-like aroma with a whisper of earthiness. It's subtle, so subtle you wonder how something so delicate can be worth more than its weight in gold. That answer, as one grinning trader explains, is simple. Try harvesting it. He gestures toward a sketch of the saffron crocus. Each flower yields just 3 tiny stigmas, and they must be plucked by hand. At dawn, before the petals wilt, thousands of flowers for a single pound. Suddenly, the price tag makes sense. The market here treats saffron as a jewel. It's locked in glass cases, weighed on scales so precise, you can see the beam tremble when a single thread is added. You watch a noblewoman's servant buy just enough to flavor a single pot of rice, the coins changing hands with a reverence usually reserved for holy relics. Historians still debate how often saffron was actually used in everyday medieval cooking, versus how often it was hoarded as a symbol of wealth. Some claim that for most households, it never touched the pot at all. Its mere presence in the pantry was the point. In the courtyard of a guild hall, you see another side of the trade. Saffron is also medicine, at least according to the apothecaries, who mix it into tonics promising everything from improved mood to sharper eyesight. One apothecary insists it can even ward off melancholy on gray winter days, though you suspect the bright color alone might do half the work. As you leave the market, a young boy chases after you, offering a small twist of parchment filled with threads. The price is suspiciously low. You take a look, and the deep, even red of true saffron is missing. This batch is uneven, streaked with yellow. Fake. You hand it back with a smile, and the boy shrugs, disappearing into the crowd. That night, in the lamplight of your small rented room, you catch a stray thread still clinging to your sleeve. It glows faintly in the flicker of the flame, a reminder that in this world, the tiniest things often carry the greatest weight. The desert is not silent. That's the first surprise. It hums slow and steady with the sound of wind over sand, the creak of leather straps, and that gentle, almost resigned groan of camels shifting under their loads. You're in the middle of a spice caravan on the Silk Road, and somewhere in those tightly bound sacks slung across the camels' flanks lies the fortune everyone here is guarding with their lives. You're on Mount Lumbersford, leaving a trail of shallow prints that are quickly erased by the shifting sand. Beside you, a merchant hums a tune that's older than the road itself, pausing only to glance back at the line of riders trailing behind. Every so often, someone adjusts a sack, checking the ropes. You've learned it by now, that those sacks contain more than just spice. They're wrapped in layer upon layer of linen, animal hide, and even oiled parchment to keep the scent from drifting too far. In a desert where scent can travel for miles, that's more than a precaution, it's survival. The caravan halts near a cluster of low, wind-smoothed rocks, the chosen spot for the midday rest. A pot of water is passed around sparingly, and small parcels of dried dates and almonds appear. No one talks about what's in the other packages: cinnamon, pepper, saffron, because here, less said, the safer you are. Still, you can't help noticing the way hands rest protectively on the most valuable bundles. You overhear two traders quietly debating the route ahead. One favors the northern trail, with its mountain passes and safer wells, but longer travel time. The other wants the southern path, shorter, but riskier, with stretches of open desert where raiders are known to prowl. Historians still debate which routes were most heavily used for the spice trade. Maps from the period rarely tell the whole story, and much of the knowledge was guarded like the spices themselves. As the sun dips lower, the caravan moves on, shadows stretching long across the sand. You realize that out here, the spices aren't just goods, they're the reason this entire network exists. Without them, there would be no Silk Road as you know it, no steady stream of merchants braving the heat and the wind and the bandits. When camp is made for the night, the smell of cooking fires mingles with faint, almost hidden notes of clove and cinnamon. You settle near your tent, feeling the desert's chill wrap around you. and listen to the low murmur of voices as deals are made in the flicker of lamplight. Somewhere in the dark, a camel sighs, and you think you hear the jingling promise of gold hidden in those quiet, swaying sacks. The wind shifts, and suddenly there tastes like the seasalty, damp, and charged with the smell of rain that hasn't yet fallen. You're standing at the bow of a spice ship, eyes on the distant horizon where the water darkens in a long, straight line. That line is the monsoon, and it will decide whether your cargo reaches its destination or rots in the hold. The captain, a wiry man with a voice like rope on wood, keeps glancing up at the sails. "She'll hold," he mutters, though it's not clear if he's talking to you, the ship, or himself. Around you, the crew moves with a practiced urgency, reefing sails, checking the lashings on the spice crates stacked below deck. Somewhere in those crates are cloves, cinnamon, pepper, and nutmeg worth more than the ship itself. You've been told that sailing the monsoon is as much about timing as skill. Leave too early, and the winds will turn against you halfway through the voyage. Leave too late, and you might wait months for another chance. Historians still debate how accurately medieval navigators could predict these seasonal winds, though their survival rates suggest they knew more than they ever wrote down. By midday, the first drops of warm rain spatter the deck, releasing the scent of wet rope and tar. The sea begins to swell, not violently, but with a steady, rolling rhythm that forces you to adjust your stance. Below deck, the cargo hold is dim and close. They are thick with spice. It's an intoxicating mixed sweet maize, sharp pepper, the faint medicinal bite of clove blending into something that clings to your clothes and skin. A seasoned sailor grins at you through the gloom. "The spices travel better than we do," he jokes, patting the side of a crate. "They don't get seasick." You can't argue. You've been fighting a slow churn in your stomach since sunrise. As the days pass, you begin to understand the unspoken pact between wind and trade. Without the monsoon, these goods could never move at the scale they do now. The ocean becomes a road, and the wind a map. And yet, every time the sails snap in a sudden gust, you're reminded how easily that same wind could scatter fortunes into the depths. One evening, as the sun sinks into a burnished horizon, the captain lets you take the wheel for a few minutes. The ship glides forward, the monsoon pushing you along like a steady hand at your back. In that moment, you feel the same quiet faith every spice merchant must carry, that the wind will deliver you safely, and that the cargo sent will greet a faraway port before the season turns again. The tavern is dim, lit by a handful of oil lamps whose flames dance in the draught seeping through the shutters. You sit at a corner table, the wood worn smooth by decades of elbows and spilled ale. Across from you, a merchant with a neatly trimmed beard leans in close, speaking in a tone just loud enough for you to hear over the low murmur of the room. He's telling you about the spice guilds. "They're not just clubs," he says, rolling a cup between his hands. "They're fortresses without walls." You picture it, a network of merchants bound by secrecy and rules that outsiders can barely imagine. If you want to trade in cinnamon, pepper, or saffron, you don't just buy and sell, you have to be accepted. And the guild's approval is harder to win than a royal favor. He explains how prices are set not in open markets but in back rooms, over quiet cups of wine. A single whispered decision from a guild master could make the price of nutmeg soar in Venice or plummet in Cairo. Historians still debate how much actual control these guilds had, but you can tell from the way his voice drops on certain words that their influence was more than just rumor. You glance around and realize the tavern itself is a kind of stage for this shadow play. At one table, a man scribbles figures in the margins of a ledger, his other hand cupped protectively around the page. At another, two merchants sit shoulder to shoulder, their faces turned away from prying eyes as they pass a small pouch under the table. The air smells faintly of spices. Someone's coat carries the tan of cloves, and you catch a whiff of saffron when a serving girl sweeps past. The merchant tells you about the secrets, guarded maps to hidden ports, contacts in distant cities who can bypass tariffs, Recipes for spice blends that only guild members are allowed to mix. These aren't written down, they're passed from mouth to ear, generation to generation. And once you're in for life. Or, more ominously, until you cross them. By the time you leave, the street outside is slick with evening mist. You can still hear the hum of voices from inside the tavern, low and steady, like the turning of a great wheel you've only just glimpsed. Somewhere in those murmurs are the decisions that will decide whose fortunes rise and whose sink into obscurity. And you, for now, are just an observer close enough to smell the secrets, but not yet close enough to taste them. The palace kitchen is nothing like you imagined. It's bigger, more like a bustling marketplace under a roof, with a smell of roasting meat mixing with the sweetness of honey. And somewhere in that medley, that sharp, unmistakable note of spice, you weave between servants carrying trays, pots, and baskets, until you find him, the royal cook. He's a broad man with sleeves rolled up, face shining in the heat. In front of him, on a long table, lies a small, cloth-wrapped packet. When he unfolds it, the air seems to change. Ginger. It's warm, citrusy bite cuts through the haze of smoke and steam like a bell through fog. The cook's eyes soften, and you realize he's holding it, the way a jeweler might cradle a flawless gem. This goes in the king soup, he says, almost reverently, pinching off a measured amount. No more, no less. The rest will be locked away. You glance around and notice that every spice, hair, pepper, cinnamon, saffron is kept in its own container, each guarded by a servant whose sole job is to make sure nothing accidentally disappears. One of the apprentices sidles up to you, whispering that a single misstep too much pepper, too little saffron can be enough to cost a cook his post. Historians still argue about how much of this was strict culinary discipline and how much was just fear of wasting the palace's most expensive assets. At the far end of the kitchen, another cook is preparing a sauce, stirring in ground cloves so slowly it's almost ceremonial. You notice how the entire room seems to hush whenever spices are added to a dish. The meat can be replaced, the bread baked again, but the spices, there's no margin for error. A servant enters with a fresh delivery from the storerooms, the spice jars wrapped in soft cloth to protect them from the jostling walk across the palace. You catch the faint aroma of nutmeg as one passes, and you can't help imagining the journey it took to get here from the Banda Islands, across oceans, through storms and politics, all to end up in his pot. As you step back into the cooler air of the courtyard, you hear laughter from the kitchen windows. For all the care and tension, there's joy here to joy in transforming these costly treasures into something fleeting and delicious. A kind of alchemy that happens only in the heat of the moment. And for the first time, you think you understand why some cooks stay in the palace their whole lives. That alley is narrow, the kind of place where you instinctively keep one hand on your coin pouch. It smells faintly of damp wood and something off. Not bad exactly, but not right either. A man in a patched coat waves you over to a table piled with small sacks, each one tied shut with rough twine. Pepper, he says, smiling like he's offering you a personal favor. You untie one and pour a few peppercorns into your palm. They look fine wrinkled, dark, and perfectly ordinary, but when you bite down, you taste grit, sand. The man's smile doesn't falter, but his eyes give him away. This isn't pure pepper, it's bulked out with cheap filler. You hand it back, and he shrugs, already scanning the alley for his next buyer. It's not your first brush with fraud today. In the marketplace, you saw saffron threads dyed with brick dust to make them look richer, cinnamon mixed with bits of unrelated bark, and cloves with their buds clipped to stretch the weight. Historians still debate how widespread these practices were, but the number of spice inspection costs along major trade routes suggests they were common enough to worry the authorities. You wander deeper into the market, past stalls selling fish, cloth, and fruit, until you spot a spice dealer you trust, or at least trust more than most. She invites you to sniff from a jar of cinnamon. The smell is sharp, sweet, and unmistakable. She tells you that any merchant worth their salt travels with a trusted taster or knows someone who can detect fakes before the deal is sealed. At her stall, you watch her test a shipment of pepper by dropping a handful into water. The real peppercorns sink. The adulterated ones float or bob oddly, betraying their lightness. The trick, she says, is knowing the cheats before they know you. You leave with a small pouch of the real thing, tied tight and tucked deep into your bag. But as you step back into the crowded street, the calls of other sellers echo around you, each promising the best, the purest, the rarest spices. You realize the truth of the market. Every deal is a gamble, and the house more often than notice the one holding the scales. The customs house looms at the edge of the harbor, its stone walls withered by salt air and the steady flow of merchants trying their luck. You join the line snaking toward the gate, the smell of seaweed and spice mixing in the damp breeze. Ahead of you, a cart piled with sacks of pepper creaks under its load. The driver shifts nervously, glancing at the officials in their long robes. When your turn comes, you're waved toward a table where a scribe sits with a ledger as thick as your arm. Beside him, a guard methodically unties sacks, scoops out a measure, and examines it before nodding. The scribe dips his quill, writes a figure, and mutters a number that makes the merchant flinch. Taxes, tariffs, fees for storage, fees for inspection. By the time the pepper moves on, it's wearing a layer of invisible gold that's already in someone else's pocket. You learn quickly that the spice trade isn't just about ships and canvas, it's about paperwork. Every port, every kingdom, every city-state wants its cut, and the rates, they're as changeable as the wind. Historians still argue over how standardized these charges ever were. Some believe they were deliberately vague to allow for negotiation, which is a polite way of saying bribery. Inside the customs house, the air is heavy with ink, sweat, and the faint scent of saffron from a nearby shipment. You see a wealthy merchant sliding a small pouch under the ledger, the scribe's expression softening as he casually turns to a fresh page. Moments later, the merchant's goods pass through untaxed. You're not sure if anyone else notices, or if everyone simply pretends not to. By midday, the line has barely moved. Dockworkers lounge against the wall, watching the parade of goods. Bolts of silk, crates of dried figs, barrels of cloves. The taxes on these alone could fund a small army or at least a very large feast. You hear one merchant joke that half the spice trade's profits are eaten by men who have never even boiled water. When you finally step back into the sunlight, your pouch is lighter than you like, but your cargo is stamped and cleared. The harbor beyond the gate feels like freedom, even if it's a freedom you just paid dearly for. As the wind carries the scent of the sea back toward you, you wonder how many fortunes have been shaved down by the same slow, steady toll of quills on parchment. The apothecary's shop smells like a library that's been left in a spice market, dusty, herbal, with threads of sweetness and sharpness tangled together in the air. You duck through the low doorway, blinking in the dim light, and are greeted by shelves upon shelves of jars. Some are filled with dried roots and leaves, others with powders and colors that shouldn't exist outside a painter's palette. At the counter, an elderly physician is grinding cinnamon and cloves together with a pestle, the rhythmic sound like a heartbeat in the quiet room. He glances up and smiles, as if you've arrived right on cue. For a tonic, he explains, tapping the mixture into a small pot. Good for digestion, or so they say. Some believe it clears the mind, too. His tone suggests he's skeptical, but it doesn't let that stop him from making the sale. He shows you a drawer of saffron threads, which he claims can lift spirits, soothe sore throats, and even bring color back to the cheeks of the sick. And pepper, he adds, is a healer in its own right. Warms the blood, drives away chills. Historians still debate how effective these treatments truly were, though records show that spices often fetch higher prices from physicians than from cooks. In the back room, a young apprentice is carefully measuring nutmeg into a jar labeled for plague remedies. You raise an eyebrow, And the old man chuckles. If nothing else, he says, it makes the patient's last day smell pleasant. You can tell if he's joking. A well-dressed woman enters, her servant trailing behind with a basket. She orders a small pouch of cinnamon, a jar of honey, and a vial of something you don't recognize. The apothecary packages each with care, wrapping them in parchment and sealing them with wax. Every movement feels deliberate, almost ceremonial. Before you leave, he offers you a sample clove tucked into a twist of paper. Chew it, he says. Keep the breath sweet and the humors balanced. You thank him, slipping it into your pouch. Outside, the street feels sharper and brighter, as if the air itself has been seasoned. As you walk away, you realize that in the medieval world, spices are more than food. They're promises of health, of comfort, of life made just a little more bearable. And whether those promises are true or not may matter less than the hope they carry. The port feels different now, less like a gateway and more like a closing door. You stand at the edge of the pier, watching ships sail out under banners you don't recognize. The spice warehouse is still hum with activity, but it's not the fevered rush you remember. Something has shifted. A merchant you know approaches, his face lined more deeply than the last time you saw him. He gestures toward a sleek, foreign-built ship pulling into harbor. New routes, he says quietly. They don't need to come through here anymore. You follow his gaze and realize what he means. These ships have sailed around Africa, bypassing the old choke points of the spice trade entirely. Cargo that once trickled through caravans and guild-controlled ports now flows along different paths, faster, cheaper, and outside the reach of old powers. Inside the market, you see the signs. Pepper is still valuable, but not sacred. Cinnamon, once hidden away like treasure, is stacked in plain view. Even saffron, still dear, is offered with less ceremony. Historians still debate whether this shift was a slow decline or a sudden collapse, but the mood among the traders is clear. The golden age is slipping away. At a tavern, you overhear a heated argument. One man insists the guilds can't adapt, tightening control over what's left. Another says it's already over, that the age of sailing empires has begun, and no wall of tariffs or secrecy can hold back the tide. You sip your drink, pretending not to listen, though every word settles in your chest like a weight. Outside, the scent of spices still hangs in the air, but it no longer feels like a promise. It's more like an echo, sweet and lingering, reminding you of what once was. The port will go on, you're sure, but without the same pulse, without that heady mix of risk and fortune that made every deal feel like rolling dice with destiny. You walk past a warehouse you once saw guarded like a fortress. The doors are open now, and inside, a clerk tunes as it tallies sacks in slow, unhurried strokes. The world is still trading, still buying, still selling, but something rare has slipped through its fingers. And you, having breathed in that heady age, know you'll never smell its equal again. The warehouse is nearly empty now, the echo of your footsteps louder than the faint creak of the rafters overhead. Dust motes drift lazily in the beams of late afternoon light, swirling as you walk past rows of abandoned crates. At the far end, you spot a single burlap sack slumped against the wall. The knot at its top has loosened, and a few black peppercorns have spilled onto the floor. You crouch down and pick one up. Even after all this time, it still carries that sharp, biting aroma, less intense than before, but enough to spark 100 memories. The crowded markets, the guarded storerooms, the shouts of merchants haggling over handfuls of spice like they were diamonds. You close your feast around it, and for a moment, it's as if the entire golden age of the spice trade is resting in your palm. From somewhere outside, you hear the faint creak of a ship's rigging. Trade hasn't stopped, it never will, but the fever that once gripped these ports has cooled. Historians still debate whether the decline was inevitable or simply the result of a few bad turns of fate. You're not sure it matters. What matters is that you were here, that you walked those docks when the air was thick with cloves and saffron, when fortunes changed with the wind and the scent of pepper could set a whole city buzzing. You tie the sack closed and sit for a while in the quiet, letting the last traces of spice settle into your clothes. The world outside is changing, routes shifting, markets broadening, but here, in this moment, the air feels like it did years ago, heavy with promise, etched with risk, and sweet with the knowledge that for a time, these tiny things were worth more than gold. As you leave, you don't look back. The scent will follow you long after the doors close, lingering like an old song you can't quite forget. And maybe that's the real treasure, not the peppercorns themselves, but the memory of their weight in your hand, and the world that once commanded. The warehouse, the docks, the voices of merchants, they're all far behind you now. The streets are quieter here, lit only by the warm spill of lamplight from shuttered windows. Your steps slow without you meaning to, the way you do when you don't want the night to end. The air is cool, carrying just the faintest trace of spice, that's so faint you wonder if it's real, or if it's just your mind holding on to the day a little longer. You find a bench beneath a leaning tree, its leaves whispering in the evening breeze. Somewhere in the distance, a ship's bell rings, muffled by the water. You close your eyes, and the world narrows to simple things, the sound of your own breathing, the creak of wood settling under you, the low hum of life moving at its own pace. It's easy to imagine that the scent will still be here tomorrow, and the day after, even if the ships change and the cargo shifts to other goods. Some memories are stubborn like that. They tuck themselves into the corners of your mind and wait for the right moment to surface, often when you're still. And the night is kind, and there's nothing pressing to do but breathe. You lean back, let your shoulders sink, and let the thought drift. Somewhere out there, someone is opening a fresh sack of pepper, or boiling saffron into a golden broth, or biting into a clove just to taste its sharp sweetness. The age you walked through may be gone, but the spices still travel, still find their way into hands and kitchens and stories. And now, as the night folds in around you, you can let it all go, the noise, the bargaining, the weight of gold and pepper alike. The only thing left to carry is the quiet,